All right, welcome everyone to our session. I'll give it some time for people to trickle in, but thank you all for attending. I know it's been a long day um, all across Canada. I was going to say, if you're in the West Coast and your day, it's noon now, so it's lunchtime. You're probably hungry. As we wait for people to trickle in, I'm really curious, where is everyone visiting from or calling from? I'll start first. I'm from Toronto. Maayan.
I'm also from Toronto.
Awesome. So we have some Ontario representation here. All right. So feel free during the conversation to type your comments and questions in the chat. There's also some react emojis down below. And what's really cool is that it's all number coordinated. So you don't have to actually click it. You can just type in numbers and they all appear. So much easier. With that, let me introduce. So we have Maayan here, and entrepreneur and disability activist. So after graduating with a master's in digital media from Ryerson University, she launched Access Now, which is a social enterprise that shares information about the accessibility of places worldwide. So as a CEO, she's created a powerful shift in thinking about the importance of accessibility, from accessible technologies to infrastructure and public policy and more. So it's quite holistic, the whole perspective. As an internationally acclaimed voice for the disability rights movement, her leadership has been recognized with several awards, including the Governor General Innovation Prize, WXN's Top 100 Most Powerful Women in Canada, and Toronto's Communicator of the Year. Something that we talked about earlier was TV shows. And so she's gotten into Succession. I feel like everyone's into Succession right now. So overall, it's going to be a great chat. So thank you so much. And please take it away.
Thanks so much, Hadon. It's great to be here. Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be able to share today. And, I've been thinking a lot about employment and people with disabilities specifically because in Ontario, we just wrapped up some events around National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So that was the entire month of October. So we just wrapped that up. But, I always find that we have these kickoff moments where it's like a day or a week or a month of awareness, but, the engagement and the awareness about the topic has to continue all year long. And so that's really what I'm here to do today, is share with you a bit about my own personal journey and leave you with some food for thought about how to create more inclusive and welcoming opportunities for employment for people with disabilities. So a little bit about me to start. I've never really had a normal job. I've kind of been creating jobs for myself since I was a teenager. The first job I ever had was in high school. The first time I had my friend who needed headshots. He paid me $20 to take his headshots, and that's kind of what started my photography career. And then I went on from high school into university and post-university as well, working as a photographer. So I was very quickly drawn to the entrepreneurial world. I have always just really enjoyed building something of my own. And when I think more deeply about it, there's also something behind that. And I think, if I look at my life, I was born with a disability. I've used a wheelchair throughout my entire life since as long as I can remember. And regardless of where I go or what I'm doing, I'm often facing challenges about the built environment and how accessible it is, challenges when I'm connecting with people who don't think that I'm capable or qualified because I have a disability, or just a slew of barriers, because the world wasn't really designed for people with disabilities in mind. And as we catch up now and try to correct some of that or remediate some of the issues we identify, there's still a lot of gaps. And I could tell you even something as simple as when I started working as a photographer, a lot of the lenses were really heavy for me. It's just like a random example. And it's not that I would expect the lenses to not be heavy. It's just that's how the equipment is made. But in order for me to be the photographer, and because I was really excited about kind of growing from like a point and shoot as a hobbyist to a more sophisticated piece of personal equipment that I could carry with me and it would belong to me and I could shoot, at a professional level, I learned how to work with heavier lenses. And the way that I did that was just by problem solving. I would constantly have to test new ideas, figure out different grips, different ways to repurpose equipment that was maybe for lighting, pair it with my camera, or find lighter lenses eventually. And all of these different trial and errors in the beginning of my career as a photographer led me to eventually creating my signature style of photography. As a portrait photographer, using specific lenses that initially I chose because they were lighter, ended up working really well for me for what I wanted to do. And in general, very constantly was pushed to figure out different things, from getting people to squat if I needed to be at eye level with them, or taking a photo from a different angle than someone would naturally come to something when they just pick up their camera. And that was really how it started for me. Literally paving my way, carving out a space for me in an industry that didn't expect me to be there. And then I moved eventually into tech, and now I work as the founder CEO at a tech company called Access Now. I've traveled a lot. I've met people all over the world, some of which who know about disability issues, some of which who don't. A lot of the times I'm dealing with, a lack of accessibility in places I visit. So in general, aside from being an entrepreneur, a female entrepreneur building a business in tech, which has its own challenges, I'm constantly navigating an additional level of inaccessibility. And the reason that I tell you all that is because it's interesting when I talk to people who don't know much about disability. They often, they sympathize, which is different than empathizing, and they're uncomfortable, or, in general, I see that definitely prior to the pandemic, I'd say that people go to great lengths to avoid adversity. And it's not something that I've had the luxury of doing, but I definitely recognize it in people, that people are afraid and they get uncomfortable and they shy away from talking about difficult things. And now we live in a world where each person has faced some form of adversity, if not prior to the pandemic, definitely now everyone has, some greater than others. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity to build empathy. Because for me, it's the adversity that we each experience that adds to who we are. And if you speak to any person with a disability, they can tell you stories similar to mine of navigating inaccessible places or experiencing barriers, problem solving through what feels like an impossible situation, convincing someone that their voice should be heard, fighting against stigma, etc., etc., etc. And as a community, people with disabilities are constantly working to find unique and creative solutions to doing things. We're thinking outside the box, literally drawing outside the lines, creating and exploring spaces that people often don't think to look. And for me, that's the kind of thinking that sparks innovation. That's the reason that my company Access Now even exists, is because I experienced barriers in the world. I had a personal challenge and I felt the need to solve it for myself. So I got creative and I used my experience up until that point of facing adversity to work through difficult problems and solve for unique solutions. And it's the skills that we have as people with disabilities that we've had to learn just in our everyday life in order to navigate a world that wasn't built for us, that I believe can be leveraged towards opportunities for employment and to build better companies. And that statement alone is one that most people don't think about. It's our job when we work as people with disabilities or people within the opportunity to hire or create opportunities for people with disabilities to think about this statement, to think about how the people who have faced adversity provide unique experiences that can be leveraged as an asset, to look at how someone who faces adversity and finds a way through challenge to turn it into an opportunity is a gift and not something to shy away from, not something to be afraid of. If we're going to close the disability divide, this is one of the biggest challenges or the biggest jobs we have. So what is the disability divide? Maybe you heard earlier in the day. I know Keely was speaking. I'm sad to have missed her talk, but I'll definitely tune into it later. But a few stats on kind of what people with disabilities are facing when it comes to employment. So currently, about 22% of Canadians live with a disability. 50% of people with disabilities have a post-secondary education. And yet people with disabilities are more than twice as likely to be unemployed than the average Canadian. So although people with disabilities are able and willing to work, many are stuck in lower wage jobs if they are employed at all. And if you look at the rate of poverty amongst Canadians, it's about 40% higher for those with mild disabilities and 200% higher for people who have severe disabilities. That's about 200% more than the national average for poverty. But that doesn't make any sense to me at all. And if you speak to people with disabilities who are able or interested in work, this is one of the biggest divides, one of the biggest gaps. We have to find how the disability lens is not only valuable, but critical when it comes to building our future economies. And this concept is not one that's well adopted, definitely not one that's well understood. And so it seems like maybe I'm preaching something because I come from this world, but now I'm going to give you a few examples to see how it's already true, and we just haven't connected the dots. We think about things like working from home or attending a virtual conference, flexible hours, the need for additional empathy and patience amongst our coworkers, using virtual tools to do your job. These are all, in the past, things that were considered special accommodations. Now they're the norm. These are all things that people with disabilities, when applying for a job or asking to be considered for a job, would often come as a form of, do you need special accommodations, if you even get to that point in the interview process? And often people, although they weren't always told, were told, unfortunately, you have to come into the office. This job isn't able to be flexible in terms of work hours. There have been often in many fields very rigid constraints about what type of person you have to be to show up, to do a job, and how that job gets done. Whether it's inherent or kind of unconscious, that these assumptions about who you are to do a job have kind of shown themselves. So when we talk about all of these concepts that now seem just normal and part of the way we live our lives, they initially were advocated for and often ignored by people with disabilities. And it took a global crisis to get to the point where these concepts were adopted. But it doesn't have to be this way. And if we listen to perspectives that are different from our own, and we go out of our way to create space, to change and adjust, these are the types of opportunities we have that can lead to innovation, can lead to inclusion, and can lead to better. So this is an HR conference. We have a lot of opportunities to talk about how professionals working within HR can be part of the solution. And that's really what I'm now going to go into. And then we're going to just have some chances to talk and ask questions. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat already, and then we'll kind of open it up. But as HR professionals, you have opportunities to help bridge this divide. Employment is one of the most important components of the quality of life for any person. And currently, people with disabilities are not part of that equation. But it's not because they're not willing, and it's not because they're not able. So what are a few things that we can do to bridge this disability divide? One of the first things you can do is look at language. The language that we use about our jobs, the way we work, the way we address each other, can be inclusive and welcoming and signal to people with disabilities that they are considered and part of the equation, or they can also be exclusive and actually isolate people further, or signal this is not a place for you. Something as simple as the word impairment or bound. When people describe me as a wheelchair user as being wheelchair bound, it signals a lack of understanding about what it is that I experience. Impairment suggests someone less than whole. It suggests an other. When we think about how do we use inclusive language, we think also about how that someone on the other end of a conversation can feel like they are part of something. So there's nothing wrong with the word disability. I say it and I'm comfortable with it. And it allows me as a person to feel like my identity is being heard. Differently abled, special needs, there's lots of terms that get thrown out here and there, and people use them in different ways. And it's very difficult, definitely if you're not exposed to the world of disability, to find your footing, as I don't use that phrase, to feel comfortable having a conversation about things you don't know about. So the first thing you can do is just become informed. And one of the ways to do that is by thinking about what language you use in your job postings, in your conversations, in your interviews. Asking those questions and going online even as a simple starting point and becoming informed about what is appropriate, how can you approach people, and what will signal to people that they are comfortable and recognized, as opposed to, I don't know even how to talk about this, let alone help you feel supported in a role. Another thing you can do is when you think about when you post a job, let's say, where are you putting it? Are you putting it through your basic streams where you're hoping that people will just apply? What is the language of that job posting? And are there any things in that job posting that signal that there is a level of awareness and consciousness about the fact that people with disabilities have been considered as potential candidates for the role? Something as simple as explicitly outlining what accommodations you currently offer. Is this a work from home opportunity? Are there accessible technologies that have already been integrated within the workforce that people would be able to use? And anything else that you might signal that says, we are looking for people from all perspectives. And there's there's quite a strong push for DE&I, but disability often gets left out. So being explicit, and going the step further and saying, if you are very interested in providing someone with a disability with an employment opportunity, go to where they are, connect with disability employment organizations. And there are lots of them out there, or networks that promote people with disabilities, and share your job postings there. You're much more likely to get responses from people when you go to where those people are. And sometimes some of the feedback that I get is, well, I really want to hire someone with a disability, but I just haven't found anyone, or I just can't seem to land someone who has the right level of experience, qualifications. It's a demanding job. How do I start? Something that I've learned in my kind of limited time over the last 6 years building my own company is that I've tried to be flexible about what that job even consists of. So let's say, for example, I'm looking at a role that typically would require someone to have 5 to 10 years of experience, a long list of items in their resume that shows me they've done it before, they know what they're doing. Can you find different examples within someone's life that would lend themselves to the same types of qualifications? Personal examples, for example, for me, I've been a director in some form or another since I was maybe 12 years old because I've had to direct my own care. I've had to hire, manage, and work with people in my life as long as I can remember. The second that I had the confidence to speak on my behalf, as opposed to my parents speaking on my behalf, I was doing it. And so communication skills, the ability to manage or organize people, those are things that I've done even before I had a job. And so are there ways, to ask questions or engage people in a way that, allows them to think, okay, maybe I don't have tons and tons of employment experience, but I do have personal experience that lends itself to an employment opportunity. Perhaps it's a small contract that allows you and an individual with a disability to test out each other, to figure out, is this something that you're comfortable doing? What tools or accommodations are not yet in place that you need to build in? It allows you to have a conversation with someone where there's a little bit more flexibility, which leads me to the next 2 points. Ensure access. Imagine showing up to a job that you finally landed and getting to the front door and the door is locked. I know it seems like a very extreme example, but you wouldn't hire someone and then invite them to a space that they couldn't get into. And so when we don't create accessible opportunities for people, whether that be accessible digital technologies or accessible actual physical workplaces, we're not allowing people to do their jobs. And this could be one of the things that actually stops someone from applying in the first place or stops someone from thriving if they do get the job. So asking the questions about, is my workplace accessible? Does it have the accessible technology required to do a role? Are other people on the team providing accessible documents so that everyone can engage? Or are we creating specific documents, let's say, just as an example, going with documents that only work for some people and not others? And that not only does it not allow someone with a disability to thrive within a job, but it also starts to create a divide between people with and without disabilities within your team. And that leads to some really difficult challenges, especially if you're working towards inclusion. You're not going to get there if people don't have the opportunities to show up and do their job just like anybody else in the organization. It shouldn't be considered an accommodation or a favor or something that someone has to feel uncomfortable about. If you've created the space in advance where every person feels confident to show up and do their best work, regardless of their disability, then disability actually shouldn't be part of the equation at all. And that's how you get to true inclusion. When people are able to show up and not even need to self-identify, and they can just do what needs to be done in their own way, and everyone works together on that, then you get towards culture and belonging. And it's a lot of work to get there. It's not enough to, get up and say, oh, we believe in diversity, we believe in equity, we believe in inclusion. It's all these tiny signals that you allow someone to say, hey, flexible work hours, no problem. Oh, you need a gap in the middle of your day because you've got to go to an appointment or you need to do something or you just need a break, no problem. How about we just shift your hours and you do it like this? And all that kind of flexibility will allow someone to do the things that they can do in the best way that they know how, as opposed to dictating how work needs to be done. And I think we've all benefited from that over the last 2 years or so. And I think that's one of the biggest things is that people with disabilities, we're experts on how to do what we do, on where to go, and often we've had to go above and beyond and do research on behalf of other people. I know what accessible technologies to use. I know what places that are or are not accessible for me. And when we open up an opportunity for people to share and feel comfortable to provide answers and not just show up with questions, and we accept those answers as a new possible way to create a policy or a process, that's when we begin to break down some of those barriers where people often feel marginalized, where they feel other, where they feel uncomfortable to show up in their whole selves, or they're afraid to self-identify, and perhaps they have an invisible disability because the culture within the organization hasn't signaled, even in the quiet ways, that there is a flexibility and an openness to change. I started by saying, the world hasn't been designed with me in mind as a person who sits on a wheelchair. And so we've constantly had to adjust and change as people with disabilities to fit our environment. But when we can take note of those examples and work to proactively remove them or collaborate with experts who already have had to do that in their lives every day, we can create a meaningful sense of belonging, where a person who has a different experience now feels valued, who feels like they're not just chiming up and asking for help, but they're also helping create change and educate people on a new solution. And as HR professionals, these types of opportunities to be open, to ask questions, and be comfortable with change, I think is one of the most important things to do before you get to the nitty-gritty of employment and accessibility changes that might need to happen or anything else. It's the human level of connection between people, where disability no longer becomes the elephant in the room, but just like somebody wears glasses and one person, might snore when they sleep, every person with whoever they are in their lives shows up and is not boxed into one category versus another. So we have a long way to go before we get there. But if we recognize that there are so many strengths and values that come from the experience, the lived experience of people who on a day-to-day basis have had to jump through hoops and adapt and create their own solutions out of thin air and not give up and be resilient and bounce back, even though it's difficult, we can see that there are strengths there. And when we look at who is the best candidate for a role, maybe they don't look like who we imagined in the first place. But based on all those credentials that come from lived experience, you can be surprised, and I know delighted, by the breadth of valuable experience that a person with a disability naturally comes to. And so the ability to take what feels like a risk, be open to change, be flexible to difference, these are the things that help start to narrow how much of a divide there really is between people with and without disabilities, and usually leads to much more accessible and inclusive experiences for everyone. So I do hope that, whether it's the way you speak, what you create, and where you share job postings, the ability to be flexible, ensuring that accessibility is not an afterthought, and working towards a culture of belonging and inclusion, there's a lot to do. And within your role, you have tremendous opportunities to pave the way, to provide leadership to people who don't think about this every day, and create experiences where people with disabilities can thrive, can be included, and can find meaningful employment. So those are my formal remarks. And I know I talked a lot. And it's difficult when you're on a virtual call to kind of just listen to a talking head. So I'd love to kind of open it up and provide people an opportunity to ask a question or a comment or anything at all. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maayan, for sharing such a wealth of knowledge with us and your firsthand experience, not only yours, but for everyone else that you've interacted with. I see some Q&A questions in the chat, and feel free for everyone else to type in your questions as well. So I will show off the first one. This is from Jeff. And many of my HR peers have shared with me that attracting job prospects from particular groups is challenging. So how do you suggest ways that organizations can target people with disabilities when it comes to hiring? I think you touched on this a bit briefly in your conversation with us, saying, for instance, working with particular organizations that are dedicated to being advocates for those with disabilities, right? Is there anything else that you want to share to that question?
Sure, yeah. So that's definitely a really great way to start, is by connecting or engaging with organizations that represent people with disabilities. For example, we recently started a machine learning project within our company, and a lot of the work requires a lot of data labeling. We've been able to connect with an organization that's helped us find credible people with disabilities to do this work with us. And so if we would have just put a job posting out on the internet, let's say, there's no way we would have been able to connect with these individuals who do have disabilities, because they're just not looking in those places for the roles, because they haven't historically seen great success or even been qualified on their own half, thinking, oh, I wouldn't qualify for a machine learning opportunity at a tech company. I've never worked in this role. So sometimes it's about engaging directly with your organizations, having conversations, talking to them about your goals, and explaining, maybe there's a way to create a job opportunity together. What would be appropriate? How could something fit? Start with something smaller, start with a contract, a part-time opportunity, a few weeks here. There's different ways to test things before you go all in and give someone, let's say, a full-time role within a large organization that requires, you to take a big risk if you've never tried anything before. So I understand how sometimes that can seem intimidating. That's one thing to do. Another thing is to signal in the actual opportunities that you do have for jobs, different ways where you can engage or signal to people who might have disabilities, let's say, that they would be welcome and encouraged to apply. A lot of people often, just based on a track record of being denied employment opportunities, will say, oh, I don't think I would get this job. I don't think I would qualify. I don't have the experience. So finding ways to signal, if you have, let's say, specific qualifications required, different ways in which those qualifications might show up. So this or something equivalent or something like this, or I just find that the language used can often signal to people a more open opportunity. Yeah.
Totally. Thank you so much. And there's one other question as well, which I'll also pop up on the screen, which is, conflicts will always arise when it comes to workplace inclusion. There's no such thing as perfect. What's the key when it comes to resolving these challenges that may arise?
It's a difficult question, because I don't know that there's a perfect answer.
Yeah. No such thing as perfect, right? That's exactly what he wrote.
Yeah, exactly. I think.
So what are some imperfect ways? And because there's multiple methods, right?
Yeah, I think something that is really important is that when they do finally have the courage to raise their voice, to ask a question or put a comment out, especially if it's a personal related challenge, for someone to come forward and say, I'm not getting what I need, or the feedback given is equally as important. When someone finally speaks up, it's really important that that's met with a level of openness and not dismissed. For example, this technology isn't accessible. I'm not able to do my role, let's say, as an example. Like, it's not screen reader friendly. I can't even open the document. It's not accessible to me. If we don't respond to that and we say, okay, well, you can't, then you won't do it, or we'll get someone else to do it for you. If we don't find a way to empower the person who's come forward, it creates a certain level of conflict and creates a larger wedge within within the relationship, either on a one-on-one or within a group setting. And so I think when people come forward and they talk about things that are signaling to them that they are not included, the ability to provide feedback and create an action plan and actually respond is really important. And I think that's one of the biggest gaps we have, is that people, let's say, want to hire people with disabilities, but then they haven't done anything to invest in the culture and the setting within the organization to allow that person to do well or stay in the role, to feel included, or to even be promoted within the organization. And so it often kind of is a failed attempt on both sides. So I think if you mean it, if there's a meaningful effort to invest in inclusion within the workplace, and I'm speaking specifically about people with disabilities, but this really is a much broader thing. It's when people come forward and share things, which first you have to create an environment where they feel comfortable to do that in the first place. Providing that feedback ongoingly, that they're heard and that things are being done about it, is really important. So having buy-in from your colleagues, from people, higher up, that this is, a priority, and that it's not just lip service, is one of the ways that you can kind of diffuse some of that conflict. Because otherwise you're having people show up and you're saying one thing, but I'm experiencing something else. And unless there's a way to make change on it, it's going to just grow into a larger issue.
Yeah, totally. Like, I feel you wholeheartedly on that as well. I just want to like open the floor to if there's any other questions or comments out there. So actually, I bring that up, I'll have a side note remark about that. I heard anecdotally from a friend in recruiting in Canada how they were trying to be inclusive for people with disabilities, and it runs the gamut. And one of them uses like a wheelchair, and so they could get through the door in the hallway, an elevator, but not the actual meeting room. And they were like so apologetic, like, I'm so sorry. And it's things like that, right? That even if like you mean well, like if you don't consider that experience, like when they come into like your space, right? And then I was talking it through, and in the end, like we managed to work it out, a different room, and that person was like the best candidate, and so we hired them on, and it was great. But I think Jeff just put in the comments, like, people don't know what they don't know, right? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I put out this piece for International Day of Persons with Disabilities last year, and it still kind of has become quite a popular article that I wrote. It was on BuzzFeed, actually. And there's like different ways to be an ally. And the last kind of step, because I kind of listed different things you can do. I said, show up imperfectly. And I think the reason that that's really important, and it seemed to be the one that resonated the most with people, that's the one that people talk about the most, because we have this concept that you have to be perfect and polished before you can start engaging. And the problem with that is, if we wait, let's say, for the world to be fully accessible in the built environment, before we start living our lives, like I would be home and never leave my house. And so, not that that's an excuse for things to not be accessible, but instead of waiting and saying, once I figure out everything, then I'll start, but finding ways to start and learn along your journey and be adaptive to change and course correct when people, when they say, hey, that's you should try something different, or actually I prefer to be identified this way, and you learn, then you become a much stronger ally, because it's through the process of experience that you know what you don't know. And if you just kind of wait to figure it all out, one day, oh, it's on my list of things. Eventually, it'll become an important thing. We'll spend time on it when we have time. It never gets done. Yeah.
Totally, it's true. So true. Like, it'll never get done if that's the mindset that you have going on. Okay, so we're at time. Thank you so much again for speaking with us today and sharing all your experiences, and Jeff for all your hard-hitting questions. And thank you everyone else also today in the chat who have been so engaged and listening as well. And so if people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
I'm on all the social platforms. I'm on LinkedIn. You can just look me up by my name. You'll find me.
Yeah. Awesome. And BuzzFeed?
and the BuzzFeed article, yeah.
BuzzFeed article. All right. So with that, is coming to a close of our Social HR Camp Day. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you soon. Take care.